Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon. We'll start in a few seconds. Terrific. Okay, we'll start, Aviva. Thank you. So, Boker Tov, good morning, good afternoon. My name is Paul Israel, and I'm the Executive Director of the Israel-Australia Chamber of Commerce, based in Tel Aviv. It is my pleasure to welcome you to the IACC's webinar titled Farrell Meltzer in Conversation with Michael Eisenberg about his new book, The Tree of Life and Prosperity, 21st Century Business Principles for the Book of Genesis. I'd like to thank the following organisations for partnering with the Chamber on this webinar: Young AICC in Melbourne, Central Synagogue in Sydney, Kingdom Builders, and Young Jewish Professionals. Farrell, I think there's an echo maybe with you. Do you want to mute? Not sure. I'd like to take this opportunity and share with you a few highlights about the Israeli economy and things that have been happening recently, specifically in the high-tech ecosystem. Firstly, it is worth noting that whilst the high-tech industry is not a huge employer, its impact is immense. And when implemented properly, it can really be a significant engine for economic growth. For context, close to 50% of Israel's exports are high-tech related. Since the beginning of the 21st century, the Israeli economy has grown by 109%, compared to an OECD average of 41%. In 2021, the Israeli GDP is forecasted to expand by 7%, which is expected to be the fastest growing economy in the OECD. Thus far in 2021, the Israeli tech sector raised a total of $17 billion US in 575 deals, almost double the total amount raised in all of 2020. The main sectors include cybersecurity, fintech, AI, big data, IoT, food tech, biotech, energy, property tech, and renewables. Israeli high-tech exits registered record figures with 180 transactions valued at $18.9 billion US. The majority of the capital volume was derived from IPOs. Their overall post-valuation reached $76.4 billion US. We at the Chamber are very excited to witness the easing of international travel restrictions in Australia and are pleased to announce that we already have close to 10 delegations planned for 2022, and that figure is constantly growing. Please get in touch with your local chamber and how learn you can witness firsthand the magic of Israel, the startup nation. As part of the trade missions, one gets to meet in person different elements of the ecosystem, such as VC investors, startups, universities, and much more. Our guest speaker, Michael Eisenberg, is a founding partner at Aleph VC. He will be formally introduced shortly, but on our chamber delegations, we happen to spend quite a bit of time meeting Aleph's portfolio companies, such as Lemonade, one of the world's fastest growing insurance companies, Spark Beyond, an AI-powered problem-solving platform, My Interview, an Australian-Israeli company focusing on intelligent candidate video screening, Bring, real-time logistics, Centrical, employee-centric success AI platform, and many more. In the absence of delegations, the IACC team has been busy conducting technology scouting, helping Australian corporates from the banking, mining, agriculture, energy, and other sectors get access to the Israeli innovation ecosystem, bringing value to their stakeholders and bridging any cultural and communication gaps. During chamber delegations, we like to not only focus on the technology aspect, but also study the cultural elements of what makes the Israeli ecosystem so unique. It is well documented that things like celebrating success, failure is not a dirty word, flight to engineering, and of course, chutzpah, all play their role in enhancing the local economy. As you'll see, our guest speaker from today, Michael Eisenberg, has all of these attributes plus more. One extra component that contributes to the vibrant ecosystem that comes up every time is the role of Jewish values and tradition. Each and every delegation gets to experience a Shabbat dinner. Each and every delegation learns about the concept of chavruta, where people study and debate the text, constantly challenging each other's mindset and thinking. Hence, when we heard about Michael Eisenberg's new book, it was natural for us to do this webinar. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Farrell Meltzer. I met Farrell back in the 90s when he was heading the private banking at ANZ and then Group MD at Investec Bank. Today, Farrell is the Group MD at Wingate and recognised as one of Australia's leading financial service leaders and innovators who contributes to many worthy causes in Australia and here in Israel, including the ISCC. Farrell has been a friend and supporter of the Chamber for many years, including co-leading one of our best delegations to date only a couple of years ago, obviously apart from yours, Kevin, in 2003. The following quote from the Wingate story, which was recently published, probably best sums up why we asked Farrell to conduct today's webinar. It is about doing what's right, about doing what we should do rather than what we can do. It's about leaving the last dollar for others, focusing on the common good, about achieving exceptional things, being transparent, truthful, patient, careful, and recognizing that the winner is not the person with the most money at the end of the journey. Thanks, everyone. Farrell, over to you.
Thanks, Paul. Thank you very much, and welcome, everyone. It's wonderful to have you all with us, wherever you are in the world, and most importantly, welcome to you, Michael, from the Holy Land of Israel. Delighted that Paul asked me to moderate this discussion. I generally am publicity shy and don't do many of any of these things, but when Paul came to me and talked about your book, which I hadn't yet heard of until Paul brought it to my attention, but then again, it had only just been published and wasn't even in print yet. My interest piqued up immediately because the subject obviously is one that is of great personal interest to me, one that I relate to greatly, and I think actually one that captures the zeitgeist of these times. Not only through the COVID experience of the past 2 years, but the groundswell that's developing in business and generally around doing what's right, doing things based on good traditional values, and having a perspective that we should conduct our business and our activities, as Paul beautifully quoted there, in the interests not only of our own personal well-being and wealth, but in the common good. So I was really very happy to, Michael, to have this opportunity to chat with you today. I initially, as Michael, as you know, and I haven't yet warned you, but I'd originally said to you, I'm going to ask you to introduce yourself. And that's because, no one wants to hear long introductions about people, and everyone can read about your great accomplishments, but having read a lot of them, in fact, having read the book now, and having listened to a lot of your talks on various formats, I came to the view that you wouldn't introduce yourself properly due to your humility. So I thought I might just pick up on a few themes that Paul has touched on, just to make sure that our listeners and audience today have a perspective of who Michael is, and I'll then pass it over to you, Michael. So as Paul said, Michael is a general partner in Aleph, which is a venture capital fund based in Israel, which manages about $500 million in funds under management. That is a very substantial size fund for the venture capital industry. What Paul didn't say was before, earlier on in his career, Michael was a general partner at Benchmark, which is the legendary Silicon Valley venture fund. And I can tell you that it's no small achievement to become a partner in a firm like Benchmark. Michael has sat on many boards, Israeli company boards, startups, has been involved in starting many businesses. And interestingly, Michael runs a blog, which is quite fascinating. It's called 6 Kids and a Full-Time Job. And you might want to have a look at it after the webinar. It covers all kinds of interesting things, from politics to technology to macroeconomics to Jewish thought. And it really is quite a special place to go and to get your ideas tested and stimulated. But I should say that the brand of the blog is a bit out of date now, because I think Michael's now got 8 kids last time I checked, and a few grandchildren. May they all be well. So Michael, your branding skills probably could do with some upgrading there, but nonetheless, the blog is very good. Michael's also written many books in Hebrew. Nonetheless, I think your home language, your mother tongue, is English. So that's quite an accomplishment to have written serious books on subjects like leadership in Hebrew. And through the course of the pandemic, as Paul said, Michael, amongst other projects, I gather, Michael embarked on this project of translating his most recent book, which is this wonderful book here called The Tree of Life and Prosperity, 21st Century Business Principles from the Book of Genesis. So I think we have someone here today who is very well equipped and ideally suited to talk to us about the circumstances we face, the world as it is today, business, innovation, Israel, the rest of the world, and delighted to have you with us, Michael. I'm going to hand it over to you to sort of fill in a little more about yourself, but I wanted to just read one short paragraph from the book. There are many, and Paul, we could have spent 3 hours on this webinar. Maybe we'll do a series. But the one paragraph I just wanted to read to you goes as follows. I'm quoting Michael, of course. I started off investing with no strategy that I could explain. I was curious, driven, and in many ways desperate to prove myself. I had a degree in political science, whatever that means, and edited the college newspaper and even created some troubles for my university administration. But mostly, I had spent my time studying Torah. In retrospect, it is fair to say that my investment strategy reflected more of my Torah values than science, technology, and markets. Perhaps this is a passion re-narrated as a strategy. I thought that was a fascinating description of oneself. So Michael, with that, I'll hand it over to you. Maybe you can just tell us a little bit about your life, your background, where you've come from, and what brought you to this point.
Sure. Thank you, Farrell. Thank you, Paul. Thanks for having me. Nice to virtually not meet everyone because I can't see anybody on this webinar. Hopefully one day we'll meet in person in Israel. So as you hear from my accent, and as Farrell mentioned, my mother tongue is English because I grew up in New York, and born, bred, raised, and educated on the island of Manhattan all the way through university. But I took a year to study in yeshiva in Israel after my freshman year of college. I studied at Yeshivat Har Etzion in Alon Shvut in the Gush Etzion area. And 1 year turned into 2 years that were fairly transformational. It was the first time I had sat down. I actually had been studying Torah and Gemara for a while, but I sat down for what turned into 2 years straight to really study. At the end of my second year in Yeshivat Har Etzion, which was right after the first Gulf War, so the year is 1991, I found myself in a room with the head of the yeshiva, Rabbi Yehuda Amital, and asked him the following question. I asked him whether he thought there was a bigger mitzvah, a bigger commandment of settling the land of Israel for someone who moved to Israel and settled in an unpopulated place, whatever, the Negev or the Galilee, or if you moved to Jerusalem and Tel Aviv, you fulfilled the same level of the mitzvah. And he looked at me and said, it's all nonsense. absolute nonsense. What you really need to do is move to Israel, make Aliyah, and open a factory to employ 10,000 people who can earn thereby an honest and decent living. And those words really changed course for me. It was the first time I heard a rabbi talk about the economy, about business, and this notion of an honest and decent living and enabling others to earn honest and decent living, as Paul was mentioning before about you, Farrell. And it became kind of the life goal to see if we could create 10,000 jobs, and if we ever got there, to move the goalpost to 100,000 or wherever the next level up is. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that. Number one, it's not about you, it's about enabling other people. Number two, when people are earning an honest and decent living, they have human dignity, and their families do better, and their marriages do better, and their kids do better. And lastly, collectively, we can create an Israeli economy that we would be proud of. One undergirded by these timeless principles of enabling others to be successful, and of these values of the Torah. And that's kind of what I've tried to be after. The piece you didn't mention, because I'm not sure it's even in the book, is like for a year and a half, I did political consulting right after I got to Israel, but quickly figured out that you don't create a lot of jobs doing that. And job creations in the business sector. So, and that's what I've been doing since 25 years, and basically in venture capital, and to the point you made, without much of a strategy to start.
Michael, thanks for that. That's a great start. I think later on, perhaps we'll come back to the subject of facilitating people to earn a respectable and decent living. I know that you have made some interesting statements through the course of the pandemic about universal basic income. You've disagreed with some high-profile people on that subject, and I think with the pandemic hopefully partly behind us, we can look back and perhaps get your reflections on the effect of handing out free money and what that's actually done for human dignity and to the economy, and where it's brought us. So perhaps we'll come back to that a little bit later, but I'd like to now just turn to the subject of innovation. We had that terrific opening introduction from Paul about Israel. We all know what a miracle Israel is on the innovation front. It's been a miracle country through many phases over the years. As we all know, the latest miracle is innovation and technology, but this concept of innovation is nothing new to us. For many, many years, for decades now, we've been talking about it, and I think it's probably 12 odd years since Israel was labeled the startup nation by Dan Senor, who I know has also interviewed you very capably. And I also know that you've coined a new phrase for Israel, which I believe is the scale-up nation. So perhaps, Michael, you can share with us, what's going on the innovation scene on the ground in Israel and globally. What are you seeing? Where are the trends going, perhaps? And how is the startup nation shifting to the scale-up nation? Is that happening in other countries? What does it really mean? And perhaps you can talk to us a little about some of the investments that you've made or are making in that regard. And in particular, some that might be of interest to our audience. I'm not sure if you're aware, but Australian business people, and certainly Jewish ones, have a compulsory pension to invest in property. So we're all interested in property, and I believe you have some innovative property tech interests or investments. So perhaps you can touch on some of what's going on in that space.
Sure, that's a lot to unpack, but maybe I'll add even to it. It is definitely true that Dan Senor and Saul Singer, who wrote the book, who are heroes of mine, by the way, because they literally branded a country. I'm not sure there's anybody else before in history who's had the opportunity to brand a country retroactively. And it's stunning what they've done, really stunning. I think interestingly, by the way, although the branding came 12 years ago, maybe the Israeli technology economy got started, call it in the early to mid 90s. So I guess we're getting close to 30 years now. Really, the innovation flows in our blood, and I kind of chart this in the book. We neglect the fact sometimes that the forefathers were also innovative, and that, Isaac, well, we can even start with Noah. Noah invents the plow, builds an ark, he invents wine and fermentation. Doesn't go that well for him. Isaac does something in agriculture. He certainly digs a well in a very unusual place near a riverbed, which would normally contaminate the well. In his case, it produced unbelievable bounty. Jacob seems to innovate flock breeding, thereby stealing the flocks of, or taking the flocks of, his father-in-law Lavan. And Joseph innovates a form of grain storage in order to save Egypt from famine. So innovation runs deep in our people and runs deep in the Torah and in the land of Israel. More recently, we're in the middle of a big transition. We forget something, which is the innovation economy in Israel is only 30 years old. That's about half of the life of the innovation economy in Silicon Valley. And innovation ecosystems take time to develop. They take time to develop because first you get the technology, and then over time you build the expertise. As the first set of companies scale up, you build the expertise to run marketing, management, finance at a global scale. So the first phase of the Israeli innovation economy is correctly called Startup Nation. We built technologies and we sold our companies to big multinational giants who could scale them. Everything from Cisco to Lucent in the earlier days, to Microsoft, now Google, Facebook, etc. But 25 or so years into this, we have the first sets of 2-time and 3-time entrepreneurs. We have a set of executives who have now scaled companies to meaningful sizes. And we've had the advent of the internet accelerated by the pandemic, where you can run a company from kind of anywhere. And so now Israelis can stay home and build the headquarters in Israel to build these giant global brands and meaningfully scaled up companies, because the kind of full cocktail is there. You can run it semi-remotely. You can market to a foreign market from the comfort of your own living room in Tel Aviv, or your office in Tel Aviv. We've got these executives, and we have the innovation and ability to deliver at scale. Add that to the fact that the technologies of the last 7 or 8 years are right up the wheelhouse of Israeli technologists who come out of the military. Machine vision, machine learning, artificial intelligence, obviously cybersecurity and other places, and other things like that. And so that's kind of the perfect cocktail for when we raised Aleph, we said that the golden age of Israel was about to be upon us. That was about 9 years ago, 8.5, 9 years ago. And so I think that's kind of where we've come to. And there's a lot of exciting companies. I mean, there's been a stunning parade of Israeli companies to the new U.S. stock exchanges this year, companies trading the billions plus dollars of valuation, but more importantly, making global impacts in a variety of industry, from solar energy to insurance to web developer tools, and I can go on. And so all that is happening and growing ever faster. And as that grows, because it's a cycle that feeds on itself, more capital comes into the market, because you can make outsized returns. And so we have what Paul described earlier as this deluge of capital coming into the country, a stunning deluge of capital. And to answer your last question, just to hit on a couple of property things to make sure we address the audience properly. So I've invested in a company called Daisy, one example. Daisy is a residential property management company that's fully technologically enabled. So at least in the United States, it's true in Israel too. I don't know Australia as well. The building management of residential buildings is an unbelievably fragmented industry. I think there are a couple of 100,000 building management companies in the United States, and each of them is small. They're very manual, very paper-based. And so if you're on the board of a co-op or a condo, or you're in a rented building, or landlord of a rented building, you have no digital tools almost to manage this. And they've built everything kind of soup to nuts, from what I call the budgets to the boilers. So the board can get a transparent budget, collect the payments, distribute the payments to vendors. And at the same time, we can use predictive maintenance technologies to check the boilers, package delivery, which has become a huge issue in buildings because of Amazon, and interact and interface directly with the residents of the building, again, not just for payments, but for joint projects and notifications and problems that are in the building. And we managed to significantly upgrade the service. I don't fully remember exactly what our net promoter score is there, but it's some order of magnitude higher than an average property management company. Who I think, and by the way, is an investment strategy, is something a friend of mine, Keith Raboy, coined. If you want to know a good investment strategy, look for a business that's highly fragmented with low NPS, low net promoter score. That means low customer satisfaction, and a big total addressable market. Bring technology, mix and shake, and you'll have a big outcome. And property management certainly qualifies there. You want me to carry on, or I can't? I think you're on mute.
Sorry. Well, let's come back to property management. That's a good example. I just want to pick up on one thing you mentioned. You talked about how many Israeli companies are listing in the US. And I think that's a relatively new phenomenon. In the past, it was venture capital money coming into Israel, or foreign companies buying Israeli companies. Now we're seeing this flow. I know that from your portfolio, I think you have one, which is Lemonade.
Yeah, another one coming next week.
Okay, great. You allowed to tell us which that is?
Don't think so.
Okay, you'll tell us next week. So let's just talk about Lemonade for a minute. It's a public company. I believe it's been very successful. It probably fits a lot of those criteria you were talking about earlier, in that you've introduced technology to an industry that's large, where most companies probably had a pretty low net promoter score. But I think there's something else about Lemonade that is unique and plays particularly to your worldview and the views you express through this book. Can you tell us a little more about that?
Sure, and we can come back to Daisy in that regard as well, because it also kind of talks to the values point. But insurance, as Dan Ariely has said and others, if you wanted to create an industry that brought out the absolute worst in humanity, it would look like the insurance business today. And the reason is insurance is a fundamentally conflicted business. At your greatest time of sorrow, you were in a car accident, God forbid, your house was flooded, the insurance company is incentivized to reject your claim. Why? Because the way an insurance company makes money is they take your money and they invest it. Now, they make money that they can invest not just by the float, which is the premium you paid, but also by having more profits, which is a direct result of paying out less claims. So it's fundamentally conflicted. Lemonade came along and said, it can't be a principles-based business, a timeless principles-based business, if it's conflicted like this. So they said, we'll sell insurance policies, but we'll take a flat fee, 25% of the premiums paid. They have zero incentive to reject the claims. They make no more money. And so in the old insurance business, which is conflicted, because a policyholder also knows that the insurance company is incentivized to reject their claims, so they fraudulently increase their claims, because they know they're going to have to go into a negotiation with these guys. And that then increases the price for everybody, therefore making it an even less principled business, because what should be a social good ends up being a crazy expensive service that they'll reject your claim for later anyway. And so Lemonade, in addition to making the business aligned by saying, we'll just take a flat fee, came and said, well, we're going to prevent fraud also. How are we going to do that? If you increase your claim and defraud us, the only person that you are going to mess over is your charity, because all excess premiums go to charity. So if you want to mess with the Red Cross or, American Cancer Association or some other good Jewish cause, the JNF, God bless, but you're a pretty big scoundrel for doing that. That's a pretty big deterrent to people to do that. So they've fully aligned this business. Charities are winners, fraud goes down, and they don't make more money from rejecting your claims. And I think in a very Jewish way, but not only, these timeless principles of alignment, of enabling other people to be successful, of bringing out the best in humanity when delivering a product or service rather than the worst in humanity, come to the fore at Lemonade. And by the way, The same thing is true of Daisy. And when we set up the business, we talked about this openly, and it's there, which is one of the big problems in residential property management is it's opaque. And you know that half the building managers are on the take and choose certain vendors because they get kickbacks. And there's a lot of cash changing hands. And we said, we don't need this anymore. Digital payments, transparency, providing transparency both to the board and from the board back to the residents, and then enforcing good values and good principles on the vendors to the building will create a better building and will create more neighborly relations and people rooting for the common cause. And that's in fact what's going on in these buildings. So it's deeply aligned around that too.
So how's it gone? How's the market received Lemonade? And has the market embraced this notion of we're building a business to make money, but also to do good?
So a line that has kind of come developed, it was actually coined by a guy named Jeff Swartz in conversation with me. It goes the following: market caps close social gaps. And so in fact, making more money and building great companies that drive fundamental principles is the best way to close social gaps. This is not impact investing, which is some triple bottom line where you can't optimize each of them. This is deeply optimized against the market cap of the business, where the bigger the company we make, the more good we can spread because the business is fundamentally aligned. And in the case of Lemonade, it's the fastest growing insurance company in the world. It's the first, to the best of my knowledge, which is transnational. It operates both in the US and Europe in all of these lines of business and can operate there. And because it's digital and doesn't have agents or brokers or offices or anything like that to sell insurance, it's pretty seamless to roll out globally. And we think the more we can roll this out and realign the business model of insurance, we can deliver more good to people and more money to charity at the same time.
So that's a hugely compelling idea. I'd like to just take it one step further down this values discussion. I come out of the investment banking sector, which I shouldn't say with any great pride. And we have Kevin McCann here with us today, who we'll hear from later, who was the chairman of Macquarie Bank, which is our iconic investment bank in Australia and a wonderful investment bank. But there are people in that industry and other industries who have this, they talk of this analogy about on the field, off the field. And when I was a young investment banker, I used to have more senior people and, more experienced and cleverer and richer who would say, when you're off the field, this is how you behave. You can be a nice fellow, you give charity, you're a mensch, to use our language, you're kind, you're respectful, you're decent. But when you're on the field, you're playing to win. You're playing to win. And you do what you got to do to play to win. And, we're all, and that finds its expression in a lot of industries and hedge fund industry and other places. I know there's a shift away from that today, but we've got a lot of young professionals on the call. We've partnered up today with YJP, Young Jewish Professionals of Melbourne. How do we speak to these young professionals? How should they be thinking about these two fields? Are there two fields or is there one field?
Farrell, make no mistake, I'm playing to win. I'm playing to win, but we're all playing to win. And what does that mean? We have, maybe I'll back up for a second. We're at a really interesting time in the history of the world right now. And I think the history of the economy, at least in the US, kind of the winds of socialism are starting to blow again. People have forgotten that capitalism is the largest driver of improvement of humankind, perhaps ever. And that we've achieved unbelievable progress due to it going back. But at the same time, I think people feel that something's off. And so kind of winds of what I would call redistributive economics and even tax the wealthy and all this stuff has kind of come back into vogue. All it should tell us is that we've got an issue, and we do, and we talk about it. And so part of what I argue for in book 3 which is not out in English yet, but is out in Hebrew, is a reframing of the economy. And my claim is that Israel at age 73 is no longer just a place to ingather the exiles. It's not just a place to run to. We need to have a vision for what a uniquely Israeli, a uniquely Jewish economy looks like. And we have a sovereign nation with which to do that. What does a uniquely Israeli, Jewish civic square look like? What does a uniquely Israeli governance structure look like? And I think we have the beginnings of the answers to those questions from the Torah and from our experience right now, and it's remarkable. And that is, I call it the empowerment economy or the responsibility economy. And what it says is, and ironically, we see this playing out around the world, just no one talks about it this way, which is we all win more when other people win. When the pie gets bigger, we can do that. We saw with the Asian tigers, by the way, and it's still going on in India and parts of China, et cetera, that as people came into the modern 20th then and now 21st century economy, the total economic pie grew. But we don't think about that on a micro level sufficiently, which is if I enable you to win, if I enable 5 other people to win, the pie grows. And that's, I think, the core thing we need to do. You want to know how to win bigger? Make the pie grow more. Take 5, 10 people into the modern economy. And there's an interesting thing going on now, which is different in the 21st century and 20th century. In the 20th century, the most important thing you needed to create economic output was a factory. And that factory had big capital equipment costs and sat there, and it had a lot of upfront costs. And no one really knew what went on in the factory other than the company who owned it. And that was kind of the core engine of economic growth of the 20th century. In the 21st century, the core engine of economic growth is here. It's the human mind, it's brains, with due deference to all the property people in Australia. In software and digitization, which is taking over the world, comes from here. And in a little known biological fact, I would tell our audience that this human brain, the head, is connected to a body. In that body is a heart. The best way to get the smartest and best brains to work on the hardest and most important problems is to talk to their heart, to talk to their principles and values. That's why they come. And not just that, those same people with hearts and brains, if we created a language, and this is something I'm spending a lot of time on, around this responsibility economy, this empowerment economy, and we said to people, it's your civic duty, and also your enlightened self-interest to drag another 5 people into the 21st century by empowering them to be successful, by lighting up their brains, by bringing them into this 21st century technology economy. Well, everyone wins more that way, and I win more that way. And this is deeply enlightened self-interest, and it's about winning. And that, by the way, is on the field. We're just bringing more people onto the field at the same time, to use your metaphor.
So we're starting to run up against the clock here, and I'm going to get the wind-up message from Paul soon, and there's a lot of stuff we still want to talk about. But one of the subjects, maybe if we've got time at the end to come back to, is how do we get more people into the game? Yeah, I think I gather there are only, as much as we think of Israel as the technology nation, there are only about 300,000-400,000 people in the technology industry out of 9 million. That's a small number. How do we shift that? How do we shift that to a much larger number, and all the more so in Australia and other countries? But let's come back to that if we have some time. I'd
Sure.
like to I just want to turn to COVID for a minute, to the pandemic. You know, it's we're all still sort of got one foot in it, and none of us are sure that it's quite gone away. And there've been, you know, a whole range of mixed feelings, emotions, impacts that we could spend a long time talking about. What for you, Michael, are the big ones? What are the big lessons? What are the big changes to technology, to perspectives on the world? What are the 2 or 3 major things that we need to be thinking about coming out of the pandemic?
The number one for me is humility. lot of experts had a lot to say early on, all through this pandemic, and the vast majority of them were wrong. And so, in the face both of exponentiality, which the pandemic has, and which technology has, by the way, in the face of a lot of talking heads and many described experts or people with quote unquote expert academic degrees who prophesied and were certain about many things, I think uncertainty reigns. And that should cause us all to be humble about how we think about the world and what happens. That's the first thing I come out with. The second thing is, I gave a talk, I don't know how many times, 15, 20 times during the pandemic on the difference between uncertainty and risk management. In risk management, you kind of know what the extremes are of the risk scenarios and you hedge against them. That's what hedge funds do, right? In uncertainty, the world is very different. And we're living in a world that is more uncertain rather than risky, in my view. Uncertainty is kind of the game I play, which is venture capital. I don't know if these companies are going to work. And what you do is, in a world of uncertainty, you make asymmetric bets on outcomes. I can lose 1 times my money, but if I can make 50, it's good. But if I can only make 4, but I'm going to lose 1 times my money very often, that's probably a bad idea. It's not asymmetric enough. And so my other takeaway is the world is more uncertain and we need more asymmetric bets. And that's true not just as business people or investors, it's true as a people. It's true as society. In order, if we want to move this forward, we need to make more asymmetric bets. And the third one comes back to the previous question you asked, which is how do we get more people in? Which is that governments or perhaps institutions of the last 200 years are failing and have failed. Globally, it's a global phenomenon. And I don't think it's their fault for what it's worth. It's just that the systems of government and the structures of government are still built with the 20th century and perhaps even the 19th and 18th century methodologies that are slow and lumbering. And there's nothing they can do to fix that right now. But we shouldn't sit here and just moan about it and complain about it and say, shame on you, government. What it says is we need to devolve responsibility or devolve duty to the civilians, to civic responsibility, and say, if the government can't bring another 300,000 Israelis into the tech force, that's my job. That's Paul's job. That's your job. And that's every technologist. And by the way, almost all the initiatives in Israel right now are coming from the tech sector, coming from civilians. The government had a bunch of initiatives that failed over the last 10 to 15 years, but civilians have picked this up. By the way, part out of self-interest, part out of an understanding that if we grow the pie, we're all better off. And I think more and more we're going to find out that this civic responsibility, which, by the way, I think is extremely strong in Israel because of the military service and the fact that everyone has compulsory military service and has to see other people other than people they grow up with in their neighborhood at a formative stage of life. This civic duty is the call of the 21st century. It's the call of our time first COVID. Don't wait for the government to do anything. Get up and do it. And I think, by the way, that's a unique Torah value, too, for what it's worth. The word achicha, or your brother, appears endlessly throughout the book of Vayikra, of Leviticus, as a way to deal with the economy. It's your responsibility, not the government's.
Well, we know that we are regarded as guarantors, one for the other. Can I turn to the book for a minute?
Yeah.
One doesn't just sit down and write a book like this. And now we've just heard that you're on the third book. How did it come about? What inspired you to write this book? I think it's, as far as I know, it's the only one of its kind. Rabbi Sachs has written many books, but they relate around similar themes, but they relate more to the social perspectives. Not specifically to business and innovation. Where did this come from?
So, like I said in the book there, I'm really was interested in Torah. And the books started as Shabbat table conversations with my children. And anybody who comes to talk about Torah, it's been true for thousands of years, brings their own lens. I'm fond of quoting or saying that the Rabbi Avraham ibn Ezra, who lived in 12th century Spain, was poor, and he looked at a lot of the stories through a pauper's lens. And Rabbi Isaac Dana Barbanel, who was the Secretary of the Treasury or the Finance Minister in Portugal during the expulsion from Spain in 1492, well, he hated the monarchy and had a really kind of politicians almost or bureaucrats view of many parts of the Torah. My lens is the economy and technology in the 21st century, and that became table conversation. I really was interested, by the way, in just explaining the verses. It was the Torah that interested me, not the business. And then over time, I would take notes on the things that we discussed at the table and I said at the table. And then some years later, I turned them into weekly WhatsApp missives in Hebrew. And then somebody called me after I'd kind of finished the full cycle and said, hey, you ought to really turn this into a book. And I hadn't really thought about it. I sat down to see if I could turn it into a book. It took a while in Hebrew. I sent it out to a couple of people as drafts. They said, well, you need some editing help, but the content is reasonable. And then the book came about. And then because I'd written really on all of the Torah already, I just kept going. And so I've done Shemot, Exodus, and Leviticus, and I'm almost done with Bamidbar Numbers with my editor. And we're working on the second book in English right now also.
Fantastic. Well, maybe
I have one book on the book of Esther, which is the first book I wrote.
Maybe the ISCC can send out to all the participants a link where everyone can get your book.
Sure.
That's fantastic. There's a lot I'd like to talk about in the book, but let's keep it moving. And if we have time, we'll come back. I caught a glimpse in the book of a couple of comments about how things have changed career-wise and how we should, you've got 8 children, Lian Hora, thank God. I've got a few. We've got many parents on this call, Jewish and non-Jewish, and we all want the best for our children and grandchildren, and we all are scratching our heads around what direction to send them in. I can tell you, growing up in South Africa as a Jewish South African, and I know this is true of you as well, I've heard you say it. My mother said, like Henry Ford said, you can have a car of any color as long as it's black. Well, my mother said to me, you can be anything you want as long as it's a lawyer, doctor, or accountant. So, that's how it was. And it didn't change much for a few decades. After the war, that's what it was, through till maybe 10 years ago. What should we be telling our children today?
This question has been around for time immemorial. As I trace in the book, I think it's in the 6th chapter. This is what Isaac confronted in changing the profession from his father, and what Jacob and Esau confronted when they had to kind of figure out which profession they would pursue. Here too, I think humility is critical. We want what's best for our kids. We often don't know what that is because we come with our own conceptions, and the world has changed. And things that we think are safe and remunerative from our own experiences turn out to be not for the next 30 years. Remember, we're at the end of a 30-year or 25-year journey, and they're just getting started. I can assure you that being an attorney and an accountant is not a safe profession for the next 30 years. And so I think, part of what's going on now is we're in this transition to the 21st century economy, which has more uncertainty, and people will take more bets rather than look for safe things because they need to surf this uncertainty. And that's sometimes tough for parents to look at, especially when they come from, it's called a safer background. But that's where the economy is going. And artificial intelligence is going to disrupt law and accounting and many things we regard as safe professions. But there are going to be new jobs created also around this technology and technology service economy. Many, many more jobs. By the way, in every economic revolution, when we went from the agrarian economy to the industrial economy, more jobs were created, right? And the same thing will be true in the technology economy. This just takes time to transition. So I think it's really important for kids to get to experiment with a lot of different things during their formative years to try to figure out what it is they can be good at, what it is they have a passion for, what it is can be remunerative and fulfilling for them. And we need to remove our misconceived notions because, again, going back to the pandemic, technology moves exponentially in many cases. And so you kind of got to get ahead of the waves because they scoot past you really fast. And so getting experience and kind of understanding technological thinking process, exponential thinking process is really important in formative years.
I want to make sure we've got a little bit of time for questions. But I've just got two more quick ones. Yeah. You mentioned Joseph. We also in Australia have a Jewish treasurer. His name's Josh Frydenberg. We haven't had many of those, but he's a very, very competent fellow. And so we know what it's like to have a Jewish head of the finance system, which is what Joseph was in Egypt. He was more than that. But what are the key lessons we learned from Joseph, and what should Mr. Frydenberg be taking away from the Joseph lessons?
I don't know Mr. Frydenberg, and I wouldn't even dare to discuss in any detail the Australian economy, which I know nothing about. But I'd say the following. Economies are really complex systems. We don't really understand them. I know people have tried to turn economics into a science. I'm unpersuaded. But even science is like we test theses, check them out. Sometimes they work, sometimes they don't. And so Joseph, who did an unbelievable job saving Egypt from the famine with incredible foresight and innovation, storing up wheat and bread during the years of plenty, and then spending it during the years of famine and injecting liquidity into the economy because there was an economic crisis. This is right, by the way, right out of the verses. This is like not modern mumbo jumbo. It's right out of the verses in the Torah. But it goes bad. And it goes bad for the Jewish people in Egypt. And it goes bad for the Egyptians who become dependent on Joseph and become basically enslaved in one matter and feel over time taken advantage of. And so even the best central planning that has the right intentions and saves a country for a while can have extraordinarily negative consequences because we don't understand how complex systems work. And complex systems are a thing, and in the modern economy, they're an even bigger thing. And so that requires us to keep an open mind about what could happen because of all the economic interventions we've gone through over the last decade plus since the great financial crisis, and certainly since the pandemic has started. We don't know what's on the other side. There's a big debate in the United States right now as to whether inflation is transitory or permanent. Is the supply chain disruption, transitory or permanent? I just read an hour ago that we're now shipping cars that have some features removed from them because they can't get the pieces, right? So cars that have typically come with heated seats. I'm not sure anyone needs heated seats, but it's okay. Are not coming with heated seats, and they're missing USB ports, and there's chips missing, and this could go on for a while. And so we don't know when we tinker, even with the best intentions, what comes out the other side. And we need a supple mind to kind of address that and keep up with it. And we need to believe and understand that this can go multiple directions, and we need to have the humility to just say we don't know. And that gives you the ability to have a supple mind about, what might come. Lord knows I don't know.
Michael, I've got the message from Paul that we need to close. I've got one last point for you to close on, and I'm not sure, Paul, if we've got any pressing questions, but I'd like to just point you for a moment to the future. We've been through, I know most countries have, but we've been through in Australia quite a huge change in the financial services sector. In particular, we had something called the Hayne Royal Commission, And what came out of it was nothing that you would be surprised about. It was do what's right, do what you should do, not just what you can do, you know, avoid conflicts, be transparent, all those sorts of things. And, you know, the Jewish people have been called the people of the book. They've been called over the centuries people of the rules, perhaps unfairly at times. But I know that you have quoted a Gemara in Tractate Niddah, where you talk about, at the end of times, actually dispensing with the rules and moving into an environment where we presume, you might call it self-regulate, where people do the right thing to such an extent that you don't need rules. What's your vision for the future, and what's your message to us in closing today?
Yeah, I have quoted that, and I explore it very widely in my introduction to the book on Bamidbar, on Numbers. That's where I broadly speaking, I believe that we are in a long-term process of diffusion. If you think about, you know, it used to be that knowledge was held by a small number of people. Then the printing press came along and knowledge got diffused ever more. And then we got to the internet, and knowledge got diffused ever more. But not just knowledge, because with knowledge comes the ability to transact and have power and other things. And I actually think with the emergence of cryptocurrencies in particular, but also smart contracts, we're going to go to a further era of diffusion, and computing power is diffusing further to the edge. So in general, we've moved to more agency. There are more people, human beings with agency today than ever in history. More diffusion of knowledge, more diffusion of compute power. And in my mind, that brings to the fore the Talmudic text that you quoted, which is to the extent that we can create self-executing rules in code, to the extent that we can expand knowledge of expected behavior, to the extent that people who take agency don't take it selfishly, but take it as a call of duty, because we found the language to tell people that they're all going to be better off in this responsibility economy by taking on duty and not just privilege and rights. Then we can get to a world where the laws, the halakha, so to speak, are less necessary in that term. And what I would call top-down lawmaking becomes less necessary. We have not yet, and this is a really important point, you mentioned the OECD before, something I've written a number of blog posts about, how I think that they're an anachronistic organization. We have not yet created the metrics by which to measure the impact of this duty, of this diffusion of knowledge, of this diffusion of power, of this self-executing nature of agency. I think if we can develop those metrics in that language, and that's something I'm pretty passionate about, we can really move the needle on this to the benefit of humanity, the economy, and our people. And I think, by the way, Israel can be at the vanguard of this.
Michael, thank you very much. I'm going to hand it back to Paul. You've been absolutely wonderful, and we could go on for another couple of hours quite easily. But Paul,
thank you, Farrell.
Thanks, Farrell. Thanks, Michael. In fact, Farrell, a lot of the questions are, can we do a second, third webinar with Michael? So we have to investigate that. But thank you both for a riveting conversation. It's now my honor to call upon Kevin McCann to deliver a vote of thanks. Kevin will be known to our Australian audience as one of the country's most prominent and respected business leaders. Kevin is chairman of China Matters, member of Champions of Change, Pro Vice Chancellor at University of Sydney, a trustee of Sydney Opera House, and was previously chairman of Macquarie Group, Origin Energy, Healthscope, and ING. And in 2013, Kevin led a delegation to Israel and has since been on a few others. Kevin, over to you. Thank you. Farrell, I think you just mute at your end. Kevin's got to unmute. Sorry, Kevin, you're on mute there.
Apology. Can I thank three people? Firstly, Paul, I'd like to thank you for organising the webinar. It's in a webinar saturated year, this is one of the best, outstanding. And I thought you set the boundaries very well. Do what is right, do what we should do. And then we have Farrell, who was really an expert interrogator of Michael. I'm certainly going to buy your book, Michael, because we didn't hear a lot about the book, but I'm now fascinated to read it. But Farrell, thank you for really asking the right questions. Now, I don't have time to go through all of the issues you raised, Michael, but a few really resonated with me. And I really liked it when our ex-investment banker said on the field, off the field. And I loved it when you said, I play to win. But I want the people not on the field to come and join me. And your commentary too about the winds of socialism and redistribution economics, we are really getting that in Australia, and I think we're getting it in the United States and probably throughout the capitalist world. And I really like having worked with some charities. The thing to do is to get people in the team on the field and assure that we get them equality of opportunity. So thank you for that point. I also like the humility point. In Australia, we have a group known as the media, and the media is never wrong. With the beautiful view of hindsight, they always get it right. And of course, they're completely incapable of thinking about complexity. And when you're dealing with a pandemic, of course, we stumble and bumble and make mistakes. But at the end of it, in fact, the Western world's come out really well. We've got pharmaceutical companies who invented vaccines that have pretty much saved millions of lives. And here we are coming out of the pandemic with your economy at 100%, which I envy. And we're still in single digits, but we have come out much better than we thought. Michael, I really do put in a plea for Paul to get you out to Australia. We'd love to see you. You're a great presenter, and you've really, what I like too about you is you challenge orthodoxy. So thank you for that. I've come away with a few of my ideas having to be refined. So thank you for the lesson, and thank you again, Farrell. You're a terrific moderator. I hope you're available for other occasions.
Thanks, Kevin. Thanks, Farrell. Thanks, Michael. Thank you to all our viewers in Australia and around the world. Shalom, be safe and healthy. Shalom. Thank you.